Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our LinkedIn Live. This time we have the privilege to be here with Isabella Chase. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So it is one of our LinkedIn Lives, our interviews that we do with prominent people in the industry, mostly with the ones that work on policy. And you are a great example of someone that has been very, very active in the last years. I'm sure you have a lot of things that you're going to tell us on how things went, but also looking into the future and covering different jurisdictions as well. So basically, as a head of policy in EMEA for TRM Labs. And I'm really curious to hear more about your positioning on the current AML transfer funds regulations, but also where the whole industry is going into the future. So it's really privileged to have you. Thank you for joining.
No, there's so much to cover, as you say, so much happening, so much still undecided. So it's great to be here for this conversation.
So I will start with a very, first personal question. We always do that. How did you end up working in crypto? You had such a vast experience working in compliance teams, working in a regulatory policy area. What got you excited about crypto? How did it happen?
It's a great question. Everyone always has interesting origin stories. Mine is it's relatively interesting. So I've been sort of crypto adjacent since about 2017, when I was working at my first startup, and it was a financial crime technology company, and we sold predominantly to fintechs, payment companies, and then one day we got our first inquiry from an ICO, so an initial coin offering. And that one call then turned into what felt like hundreds of calls over the next few weeks as the ICO boom just took off massively. And there was a belief in the crypto ecosystem that, at the very least, you should be sanction screening the people buying into your ICO. So when that all happened and then the bubble burst, it was just a really fascinating hype cycle to witness firsthand. And so then I was always just sort of like following the industry from then on. I then went on to a think tank called RUSI at the Royal United Services Institute that did some of the first work looking at how North Korea was using crypto as part of its proliferation financing mechanisms, did some of the first work also on the role of online games in proliferation financing, terrorist financing, and how crypto was involved in that. So the whole time was sort of watching how a lot of these conversations were evolving. And then I was doing a big project on digital finance and financial crime compliance, where it became very evident, this was around sort of 2021, that we were about to really experience another big page turn in the world of value transfer. Digital finance had progressed, fintech was in more and more mature, but crypto was becoming so much more of the conversation. And I really wanted to sort of step out of the policy direct work and come a bit more into the industry and be part of helping to shape the regulatory response to what was this really interesting technology that had these benefits for financial inclusion, but also, as I am a first and foremost anti-financial crime person, also huge possibilities for combating financial crime, which is not what people always think with crypto. They think crypto equals fraud, scams, bad things, but there's actually so much possibility in how we can combat illicit finance that's exploiting the sector, and that got me really excited.
That's a very fascinating story. And actually, going forward with my next question, which is related more to what's going on, how is the AML, kind of rules, frameworks, how are they evolving in crypto? It's very interesting to think about, the first ICOs when there were no KYC, there was nothing, in terms of AML. And I just heard like an interview recently as well on how things are changing. Like, think about the access to exchanges without any KYC. And that happened very early, 2014, 15, like 16, that was possible. And now for the whole ecosystem, it is acceptable. We do know that like some kind of identification when we do access those centralized entities is needed, and it's something that we do accept it, and it's in way normal, even for the ones that were here very early. So looking into the whole, years, it's almost 10 years since you've been in this space, you've seen so much. Looking into the evolvement, like what do you think, how do you think the whole trends, what's happening? Like if you would talk to someone that just joined crypto for the first time or seen this industry for the first time, how are things evolving?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's always interesting to remember that, there was also a time when banks didn't have any KYC. And that was actually relatively recent. It was the mid-80s when credit institutions in the US introduced some form of checks on who had accounts and started recording transactions. So the whole world of combating financial crime through this means of proving who you are and looking at typologies and transactions is super new. But yes, there was totally an era within crypto, sort of, totally in 2008 up until 2018, where there was, this Wild West where everyone talks about when you had no controls. Things are much more developed now. We've had a framework for controls since about 2018, which was that application of the Financial Action Task Force. It's his 40 recommendations to the crypto ecosystem, mandating things like KYC, enhanced due diligence, the travel rule, which we will talk about, I'm sure, a little bit later on. So I think what we've seen and what we saw in the initial period of, let's say, 2018 to 2020 was an industry really grappling with what does that mean for us? Like, what do those rules look like for this technology? What can be done differently? And what maybe unfortunately has to remain the same because of supervisory expectations? I think where we are now is an interesting one. I think you have certain parts of the sector, so the centralized exchanges, that are really proficient in what they're doing. They really know how to identify financial crime, what risks are looking like. And for them, I think there's more expectations from regulators in terms of, you've got the benchmarks, you've got the basics. How do we now accelerate all of this to be more real time and more dynamic? I think all of this is set against quite a difficult geopolitical landscape. I think geopolitics is something that is going to shape what financial crime compliance looks like for this sector in this next era. I think the nature of threats is now so fast that control frameworks have to be really real time, have this ability to capture crime pretty much as it happens. But also criminals are just so much more sophisticated than they were back in 2014. I mean, like, you look at the Mt. Gox hack versus the Bybit hack from February, that level of just the initial sophistication in the hack and then the level of sophistication in the subsequent laundering, completely worlds apart. And so I think the evolution is really around how criminals are driving the nature of the threat, but then the increasing expectations on an industry that should have more mature approaches than it used to.
So that's very interesting. Comparing those two hacks, it's something that, for the listeners that were here very early on, they for sure heard about Mt. Gox, but definitely heard about the latest Bybit hack. And as you mentioned, there's been so many comments around the hack, and there's been so many comments about the sophistication. And we do also hope that we're getting sophisticated as an industry as well. When we think about teams adopting, thinking about compliance, etc., crypto as a service providers, but also regulators as well. And you've been involved so much with regulators. You've been, involved in the discussions with FATF, specifically, as you mentioned before, on the travel rule. That's been something that we have been working on in Europe as well. So if we focus on this specific thing and the recommendation that first came from FATF, and then of course it was implemented in the basically regulation in the jurisdictions of the EU, US, UK, etc. Thinking just about the travel rule, how are virtual asset service providers, adopting what is happening? And I know it's really hard to generalize because we have so many jurisdictions, and some have adopted this rule, some haven't yet. But maybe if we focus more on the EU later on, I know that you're familiar with the UK examples as well. Thinking about these two jurisdictions first, where are we at? Do we have enough knowledge? Are we able to, follow all those rules? As we know, in the EU, there's not only travel rule, but as the service providers, they also need to comply with MiCA. There's so many other things. Give us a little bit of what's happening.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. The travel rule, I think what we will all look back on the travel rule in years to come and say that it was a really useful regulation in terms of showing how, well, not a regulation, a rule, how things need to change for this sector. Because the concept of the travel rule, again, it's existed for decades, but it works best when you make sure you have a cross-border transfer, but it's happening over a period of days. When you have a sector that is inherently cross-border and happening at the speed of the internet, I think this type of rule probably doesn't work at a fundamental basis. And so we need to learn from this experience and some of the challenges of implementation, and think through, in the future, what does this mean for other ways of having reporting requirements in the industry? In terms of how it's worked in the UK and Europe, the UK is a little ahead in many ways on the travel rule. It finalized its rules came into force in 2023, so it feels like it's been in around for quite a long time. I think there's been lots of learnings across the road of implementation. The EU is much more recent in its journey, with the rule coming into force on the 31st of December last year. So really, it's only been live for coming up to 4 months. That, as you say, coincided with MiCA for CASPs also coming into force. And I think those two things together are really quite remarkable that have to be dealt with from a compliance perspective. I think one of the greatest challenges with the travel rule, and we see it just when comparing these two jurisdictions' approaches to it, is that there are just these jurisdictional differences that make things more difficult. So, we've already covered one, the fact that it has come in at different times in different countries makes things difficult. It's hard to sell that sort of internally to your boards or your risk committees when you don't have like a really hard deadline, when it's this sort of constantly moving deadline around the world, depending on the different jurisdictions that you service. But of course, then at the basic level, the thresholds are different. So in the UK, there is no de minimis threshold for CASP to CASP transfers or VASP to VASP. But for VASP to self-hosted wallet, there is a risk-based approach. And if you find elevated risk, then it applies. If it doesn't, but of course, everyone's risk-based approach and risk appetite is different. So that also creates complexities. Whereas in the EU, there is an €1,000 de minimis threshold on CASP to CASP, but the requirement to identify self-hosted wallets and the rule always applying to self-hosted wallets. So just between those two jurisdictions, those are actually quite big differences that need to be accounted for by CASPs. And I think we'll continue to see quite a challenge in implementation. I mean, you must hear lots from your members in terms of challenges they have with the travel rule.
Yes, absolutely. And as you said, like you had already some kind of a experience with the UK and you see how things are going there. And I think that the EU, just in general, we have so much right now. Like, as you mentioned, MiCA and TFR, and there's like DORA, and there's so many things at the same time that is, I think we need a little bit more time for the CASPs to adjust, but also the supervisors, everyone else, to see what are the best practices, and hopefully they will manage to, comply within the deadlines. At least for MiCA, we do have the grandfathering clause, so it might be longer if they have registered before, etc. So there are like very interesting challenges, but I think what is in a way good, what was also good during the whole negotiation process was that everyone in Brussels was open for feedback. We had, discussions. There were like so many things that, were organized, events, etc., position papers. So I do hope that that is going to continue as well when we're looking into implementation. And specifically, I'm sure you've done a lot of work as well on ESMA and EBA, looking into kind of how to guide the local authorities as well. And then specific authorities, of course, looking into their own jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there is lots of guidance also from FATF itself. They do their yearly implementation report on recommendations 15, and 16 is attached to that. And really, I think if I was a jurisdiction looking for best practices on how to implement the travel rule, the last two reports, they go into a lot of detail into what are the trends around the world, what are the implementation challenges, but also what are the good practices that are emerging. So you can learn a lot from those resources as well.
Absolutely. And that's also something that gives an opportunity for many people to meet at the same time. When you go to FATF meetings and talk about different jurisdictions, the trends, etc., we've seen different reports of how the trends are changing over the world, and seeing different jurisdictions facing different challenges. That's definitely very, very useful. Going back to what's happening in Europe in a way, we have MiCA, we have everything, but like, how are you with TRM Labs, for example, helping a VASP that needs to be compliant right now? And I think would be great for everyone to also hear more about TRM Labs in general. And how do you help crypto as a service providers? What is your goal? And maybe some also future developments or some projects you're currently working on that excites you.
Sure, not a problem. So MiCA, obviously not directly a financial crime regulation, but as part of authorization processes, CASPs have to make sure they have in place really strong risk assessments for financial crime exposure, really strong governance to do with AML, and that senior leadership training to ensure that this is a firm-wide risk that is well understood. The other thing about MiCA is obviously it gives us that really useful list of what is a crypto asset service in Europe. And that list directly relates to the obliged entities in the forthcoming Anti-Money Laundering Regulation, which will come into effect in 2027, I believe. So we are really on hand at TRM to help CASPs, whether they be credit institutions offering crypto services or crypto native businesses, with the insights, the data, and the technology that they need to really understand the risk exposure that they have to financial crime, and then manage it into something that is appropriate for the business. So if you haven't come across TRM Labs before, we are a blockchain intelligence company. We were founded in 2018, and we build really risk data and screening services for a range of different crypto businesses. So really, our sweet spot is our data that we build from 34 different blockchains. There's some really cool ones on the way. I can't mention them, but particularly relevant to the European market. We structure that data, and then we layer it with both open source and proprietary risk information, which really allows us to understand, what are the risky areas of the crypto ecosystem, what are transactions with elevated risk, and how and what do CASPs really need to know. And then all of that is fed into our sort of Know Your Entity product, which helps you understand the other CASPs that you're interacting with, really useful for the travel rule, but also our wallet screening, transaction monitoring services as well. So really, we offer the full suite, and should give CASPs in Europe that really robust view of what is my true exposure, how am I comparing to other CASPs, and then how can I operate and transact in this world in a secure way. In terms of things I'm really excited about, it's some of our more sort of proactive and community-driven work that we're doing at the moment. So, lots of people have really compelling blockchain data and great screening services. Something that we've really realized at TRM is that more sort of reactive work, which is focusing on transactions that have already happened, is incredibly valuable, but we want to try and get a little bit more ahead of crime. So we have two really cool initiatives. One, our fraud reporting platform, chainabuse.com, which I'd really recommend anyone taking a look at. This has now had over 1 million reports of frauds and scams that have happened in crypto. And so if you, as a potential victim, or suspect you might be involved in a fraud, you can search the wallet address that you're being told to send funds to see if anyone else has reported it before. And that's a really key way of preventing people from being targeted. So chainabuse.com, really worth checking out. And then also a really cool project that we run with Tether and Tron, the T3 FCU, T3 Financial Crimes Unit, where as the three entities we work together to identify some of the highest harm incidences of illicit finance, which use Tether on the Tron blockchain. We investigate it at TRM and then try and seize the funds. And to date, we have over $150 million worth of illicit crypto that we've managed to seize through that partnership. So those are a couple of things I'm really excited about at the moment.
Wow, that's exciting. That's also something super important. As you said, when something happens already, of course, we need to react very fast and do everything that has to be done in this very highly stressful moments, of course, for the project, but for the whole industry as well. But what can we do on prevention? So you do a lot of things, like when it comes to education, you share those projects, like you're working with regulators. I think it's something that is really important. Education has not been ever emphasized enough. I think we really continuously need more. And thinking about that, also with the new, I would say, AI tools that we have now, and they are available. So they're available globally. They're available for us, for the industry, for the regulators, but also for the ones that commit crimes, financial crimes. So have you seen any kind of increased sophistication in maybe AI-driven crimes, and what's is it in a way harder to identify, or it's harder to basically fight, or can we leverage AI as well and basically become as powerful or even more as anyone else that might be on the other side committing a crime? How is AI changing the whole scene?
In many ways, and I'd love to say I'm going to be optimistic. And to your second point, yeah, I think we can be as well enabled by AI as the criminals. But yeah, it's incredibly interesting. AI has this universal benefit, right, which is removing the bottlenecks in inefficiency that are often created by humans. And so that increase in efficiency and productivity is useful on both sides. I think where we see a really high level of application of AI is in the frauds and scam space. So here, how useful to be able to automate all of your outreach to potential victims instead of having to individually send messages, to have that process automated using AI agents really speeds up and increases your attack surface area for as a criminal trying to find your next victims. I think also, I'd like to say that we'd all got a bit better, to your point around education and awareness. It's spotting the links, spotting the messages that felt like, this is a bit too good to be true, or it just didn't feel right. AI, I think, makes that even harder when things can be made so much more convincing. You have great natural language being produced by LLMs, and also the ability to translate into a broader range of languages. English language countries were historically the target for a lot of transnational fraud because people speak English, and other jurisdictions were sort of harder to attack. And that's not necessarily the case anymore when you have really high quality translation services that are powered by AI. Another thing that I'm sort of thinking through at the moment, especially in fraud and scams, which I think is concerning, is the combination of AI and then re-embellished by human presence. So we've all heard of pig butchering, which is the phenomenon of you entrap a victim in a romance scam. You speak to them over time. You say, hey, join this Bitcoin investment. Don't worry, you'll get all your money back. And incrementally, you give more and more money until the point where you can't. You've given your life savings and you can't withdraw any of it. I think education was improving around that, but now we're seeing this evolution in the scams world where, sure, a lot of the engagement is still done via AI, but there's also use of real life models who are brought in at those moments when victims feel like there might be something up, and they might do a video call with them, and that re-entraps the victim and makes them think, well, no, actually, this could be a real thing. So I think, we've seen lots of increase in efficiency enabled by AI, but I think that is going to go into an even further step where AI is then complemented by human reinforcement, and that's going to make frauds again even harder to spot, or it's going to be even harder to convince or educate people on what to look for because they're just going to be so much more convincing. But not to be all doom and gloom, I think there is also a lot of positive things we can do with AI, to a point that I know that it's kind of slightly random, but you and I have spoken about in the past. When we think about privacy on blockchains, people often think that financial crime prevention is quite an inherently privacy attacking activity. That can be the case, but I think what AI really enables us to do in a reliable way is to identify transaction patterns that we think are illicit, and not just identify them in small instances, but across entire blockchains, and then either blacklist or whitelist the associated wallet addresses. Now, that doesn't involve KYC or knowing people's identities. It's solely based on, what are you as an illicit actor doing? Are you transacting in a way that makes no economic sense? And the only explanation can be you're trying to disguise the source of funds that you are transacting with. In TRM, we have we call this process signatures, or identifying these signatures of transaction behaviors. And AI allows us to, having once identified these transaction patterns, to really extrapolate them across huge data sets. And I think that is a particularly compelling and interesting area which we could use AI in the future for pattern analysis to disrupt financial crime.
Yeah, and very interesting, as we mentioned before in a preparation for this call as well. There's so much data that we can see in a public blockchain versus a private one, and there's differences in how to approach when we think about any kind of potential problematic in a way sources coming from both, and that's super interesting. I'm sure we're just at the beginning of the AI development. There's going to be so much more in the future. And I think we're all, in a way, also excited about the opportunities that we can all leverage. And as we started very, early with ICOs, then we had like the first recommendations, first rules, etc., in different jurisdictions. Now we add AI as well. So it's a whole circle. I'm sure we'll have more things in the future as well.
It's never quiet.
Of course. It's never boring.
No.
So the next thing, in way we mentioned, and we're kind of like, thinking about that continuously, as our listeners also know, in the previous mandate, it's very important for the EU, I would say, because we have finalized the markets and crypto assets regulation, we have finalized the transfer funds regulation. It's also now in a way public, and it's been updated to crypto specifics. But with anti-money laundering, it's not applicable yet. So this is the part where of course, has been discussed in the previous mandate. Right now, it's in the secondary technical process. We do have recommendations, guidance, regulatory technical standards coming from EBA mostly, and also questions, feedback that can be sent to EBA from the industry, from anyone interested. So you can follow that as well on their website, on our social media. I think it's a pretty important in a way process, because the secondary technical process is really the one where the details are being discussed. And it's something that, it's also a good thing if we think about the EU, that allows this opportunity for discussion and also gives the guidance before to the industry to give feedback to. So that's where we are at the moment with anti-money laundering, with the whole package, and also with a specific part with the anti-money laundering regulation, but is very specific to crypto. That part that, of course, is not covering only crypto, but we have a part that is really directed on in crypto. So this part here, as you mentioned, you are getting ready for that as well. We do have some clarity, because now we know who are the in a way crypto asset service providers, how are they defined, etc., and they will need to follow those rules. So thinking about the anti-money laundering and thinking about your services, do you see, can we learn something from maybe the implementation on transfer funds regulation and apply it? And I know it's very different, it's not the same, but can we apply it, and can we think about how the AML can be implemented, will be implemented in the future? And hopefully, the casts will have some time to breathe, to think through the whole implementation process, until it's not going to happen until 2027, as you mentioned. But are there any things that you would want to maybe share with us about this specific thing? Also, maybe something that you have worked in the previous years on the whole legislative process as well.
Yeah, it's again a big old time. This is a huge uplift for the EU. I've been involved in EU AML like not that long, only since the fourth anti-money laundering directive. Since then we've had the fifth, and now there was a mini sixth, and now we have AMLR, which is complemented by a sixth AMLD again, and a couple of other regulations as well. I see it as an opportunity. I think every new directive or now regulation is an opportunity for an obliged entity to go to their board, to re-educate on the importance of financial crime, to really advocate for those additional resources that are needed, to do quite a fundamental, from bottom up, what is our financial crime framework? How does it need to be changed? How does it need to evolve? So I would see it as an opportunity. I'm saying this, I'm looking down at my calendar and thinking, gosh, it is the 29th of April, 2025. So there is to do a really deep, thorough analysis of your framework aligned with the text, bearing in mind that we don't have a lot of the level 2 stuff yet. You actually have, you need to be working on it right now, which, as we've already mentioned, competing compliance priorities, you're going to be looking at MiCA, you're going to be looking at TFR, you're going to be looking at DORA. So it's unlikely that it might not get the resources it deserves. I think in terms of changes, there are quite a lot of changes that crypto businesses have to be aware of. Of course, it's an increased set of obliged entities, treatment of CASPs in third countries, anonymizing or anonymization providing technologies have quite a lot of requirements. is any of that sort of very outside the realm of conversations that are happening elsewhere around the world? Not really. But it will be difficult, as you say, to actually come up with those technical solutions. How do I exclude a lot of those businesses from interacting with me? I think will be difficult. But I think it's not impossible. And again, places like TRM are very much on hand to help with a lot of that counterparty due diligence work that is needed to then feed into control frameworks. A couple of additional areas that I think are important. So related to the AMLR is, of course, the new Anti-Money Laundering Authority, which will be the supervisor of financial crime supervisors, and will go on to also write a lot of the rule book for AMLR. It also gets the responsibility for financial sanctions enforcement. And I think that will be increasingly important for crypto over the next few years, as going back once again to the geopolitical forces that are shaping the world at the moment, I envision over the next few years that we could see some fragmentation between US and EU sanctions regimes. And that's just going to be another challenge that has to be navigated by crypto businesses. We've seen the situation with Tornado Cash in the US. We have the recent sanctioning of Garantex in the EU and the takedown of that service. As negotiations in Russia continue, how the EU chooses to pull sanctions levers with the Russian crypto ecosystem will be really, really interesting. Is there a world in which oil price cap sanctions disappear, but we look at different sanctions on ruble-based stablecoins? It's going to be really fascinating. That's going to be a lot of learning as we go, I think. But I think if I was a crypto business who was feeling relatively confident with my AMLR compliance, I'd really be asking myself, okay, so how am I future-proofing my sanctions program when I have this new, well-resourced supervisor in place in a more complicated world? That's what I would be looking at.
That's brilliant. I think that many times we are underestimating supervisors, maybe even legislators, because they're like, in a way, they're having and they're exposed to so many sources. I'm thinking even the way how the legislative process in the EU works, where there are so many companies and organizations that are sending feedback, updating, like sharing information. It's really, I think it's wonderful to see that this is happening, but at the same time, we should never underestimate, because again, where everyone is doing their job learning, and at the same time, the trend that you mentioned, even what we can see within the crypto industry, that it might be also regulated in a kind of, I would say, newer manner, in a more centralized manner from the EU. So we rather have regulations than directives. We do have this new AML authority that is going to be something that is like a centralized authority in the EU. So there's a lot of things that will come as a kind of a centralized authority versus, relying on your local authority. And it has been, I would say, again, a trend in the crypto industry as well. There's been also discussions now of potential centralized supervision for bigger, more important cases from ESMA, etc. So that's definitely a trend. But the other one that you also mentioned is what is happening geopolitically, what's happening in the US, what's happening in other jurisdictions, and seeing how things will evolve. Let's say thinking about, as you mentioned, crypto was something that was always thought to be global. Usually it is global, and complying and following different rules in different jurisdictions might be challenging. So I just try to sum up some of the thinking as well. And for the last question, really looking into the future, we mentioned the trend of centralization in the EU. We mentioned maybe different rules, slightly different rules in different jurisdictions. Thinking about the future of the industry, that I would say is very heavily a finance industry, like it's really going into the direction of connecting to the traditional finance. We're also talking about tokenization, etc. Like, what would you? I don't want to ask you for predictions. This is very, this is something that it's not very easy to do. But like something that you're excited about, some other trends that you see, and definitely, I would also say, increased burden of compliance for projects that are working globally that would want to be present in different markets, and maybe even adjustment to the product that they have to different markets as well.
Gosh, it's such a good question. I think just to your point around centralization as a core trend, can you have centralization without consolidation more broadly? I think that is probably something that we will see across key markets. You made the very good point that there is the concentration around financial services as a use case. I think, yeah, that is something we will probably see, is actually the size of regulated markets becoming smaller with fewer entities, mainly because the compliance burden is so considerable. I would like to think that there will still be areas for innovation in the decentralized space, which maybe has a more decentralized supervision model as well. But I think that's yet to be developed, yet to be tested. So I think those will be big shaping factors over the next few years. I think also, we're going to see the continued emergence of these real crypto hubs where the quality of supervision, which is really based on the level of engagement that supervisors have with the sector and their level of openness, will really define their success as hubs. I think we've seen that happening for many years. You think in APAC, in the Middle East, but I think it's still up for grabs in key jurisdictions like the US, where we hear a lot of noise, but we need to really see practical examples of that openness, of having pragmatic conversations with the industry. The same in the UK. There's still quite a lot to be determined with the UK's framework, and then also in the EU, we've had a quarter of MiCA authorizations reported to ESMA. Check out the TRM blog, where we recently did a blog post on where those countries are popping up, where people are choosing to authorize. But again, I think it's still sort of relatively up for grabs which are the member states that are going to capture a lot of the market. Will be really interesting. So I think, yes, trends around centralization, consolidation and compliance will continue. I think, just briefly on the financial crime side, I think we will continue to see this just dramatic increase in the pace of threats and the sophistication of threats. To add another C to the mix, I think what we will see emerge from that is more community-driven responses. So how, as a community, can we better protect the ecosystem? I think that's going to be really, really key to shaping compliance. I think when we think about the nature of the threats that we face, you learn very quickly that a public sector only response is not going to be sufficient. We have to work in public-private partnerships, and the crypto sector has to be seen as an equal member in all of this. You mentioned before we jumped on here that you'll be at Point Zero Forum next week. So will I. Come to the TRM workshop on the 7th of May at 10 a.m, where we'll be talking exactly about this, about community-driven solutions to the threats that face the industry. So I think, yeah, that's a trend that I'm particularly excited about. We saw it in response to Bybit, just how the ecosystem came together. And I think there's much more to come there.
That's very exciting. If we think about this industry, I would say that something that we can do and know how to do is cooperate when it comes to challenges like this. Even when it comes to policy, there's like a lot of competition, as we say. There's a lot of collaboration, and I do hope that this will continue in the future. I'm looking forward to see you in Zurich as well, and I think many listeners will be there. So I would really thank you again for taking the time to do this interview with us. We learned a lot, and we do know that we need to focus on these challenges because they're real, and there will be like more of them going into the future. But also, the anti-money laundering is not done yet. The regulation and the directive, we do have a lot of in way regulatory technical standards and guidance coming up. So there will be updates coming from EUCI as well. And I'm sure we're going to hear many, many interesting things from TRM Labs and yourself as well as one of the, I would say really one of the most prominent voices in the space on this subject. Thank you again.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation and look forward to seeing you and any other listeners next week in Zurich.
See you soon. Thank you.